Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Draft Capital here on the Nothing But Net channel on Dash Radio. I'm Stephen Gillespie, and joining me is very special guest. He is a senior draft analyst for Basketball News, the owner of Babcock Hoops, there, and is also a scouting advisor for several teams, that being Mr. Matt Babcock. Matt, how you doing?
Hey, Steven, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Glad to have you on the show today. And you know, we did a little bit of talking beforehand, and getting to know each other. I'm excited to have you. I'm friends with Nathan Grubel, who Draft Deeper heard you on the show then, and was excited to hear that and get a little bit of background. But you know, I'm excited for the listeners to maybe hear a little bit more about your background before we talk about some players in particular. If you could just let's go ahead and just lay that out right now, Matt. Just how has the experience that you've had in a basketball family is where I see a lot of written things about you. You reference your basketball upbringing a lot. How does that weigh into the way that you watch the game now, and how do you kind of blend that with your own like independent analysis? The other influences that you've had growing up.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I grew up in a basketball family. My uncles and my dad have worked in the NBA for a long time. Before I was even born. So I grew up in it, grew up around it, and kind of seen basketball from every angle. I mean, I was a player. My dad was a coach for a while in college. I played at junior college. I played AAU. I played at University of Arizona. I coached, and then worked as an agent for a long time. And so I really feel like I've got a pretty wide range experience within basketball. And now that I'm scouting, I'm able to utilize a lot of that experience and my background to kind of give a different outlook on some guys and sort of what my vision as far as what a certain player's trajectory might be different than the next person. Just because I've sort of like lived it and been on the other side of things in the trenches with the players as a representative, been a player myself. So yeah, I do think it has affected me quite a bit.
Sure, and I'd like to dive into the scouting aspect a little bit more, in particular with the scouting with your history as kind of representing players as well. Um, we see kind of sometimes that players who come into a draft, maybe preseason. Look at a guy like AJ Griffin. Come into the season was widely regarded as a top tier talent, top five to a lot of people. We saw that he had injury histories, right? And then we've seen other major media outlets like drop him completely out of their first round, things like that. And I know sometimes that kind of raises a question as to what's really going on. Is this only due to injury, or there may be some practice concerns? We saw some stories of that come out as well. With your experience as kind of an agent as well, how do you sift through that as an evaluation of talent now?
Well, I mean, similar to how I approach things as an agent, I apply this concept to scouting as well. As I look at every player on a case by case basis, and I think there's a number of different sort of equations, if you will, that could lead to me thinking the guy holds a certain level of value. And it doesn't have to be the same variables in the equation to equal that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and so with Griffin's situation, I mean, we were talking about it internally too, of like, hey, he naturally needs to slip because he's not doing much, right? He started the season off, injured, and then he had the slow start once he came back. And so, I mean, I always kind of look at it as a balance of, all right, we need to project guys what they're going to be, and like that's probably the hardest part is projecting an 18-year-old kid that's not producing at a high level, but has all the tools to be a big time player within 2 or 3 years. And then obviously you got to look at other guys that are more polished up, that are producing at a high level. And I mean, again, just going to the case by case basis of like it's not one or the other. You just kind of have to figure out and break down each guy with what you have presented to you.
Absolutely, and I can see that having that additional information could help you right now, right, Matt, as the senior draft analyst for Basketball News, having that insight, that background, and then obviously reaching out to people within the industry as well, and kind of getting a feel for where they're evaluating players. I'm sure that helps out a lot. We recently just had Chad Ford on the show, and I spoke with him about that intel and what that kind of does for you as an analyst and projecting where you think players will go. Do you think that having that extra information is more helpful, or does that kind of compound things as well?
Well, I mean, one thing that's I think important to note here is that the way I do the big board, and then when we convert to a mock draft after the NBA regular season is over, this is more of my personal rankings. I mean, the way I look at it as there's a number of draft analysts that we're all evaluating players, but some of them lean heavier on intel as far as projecting where a player is going to be picked rather than where they think he should be picked. Throughout the whole year, I do more of this is sort of like I'm providing advice to the whole industry. Like, this is what I think based on my evaluations and the information I've gathered either myself or from my guys that are working with me. And then two weeks before the draft, we kind of shift gears a little bit and go a little bit more reporter style where we're projecting the picks. So anyway, that's one big difference I think there is between some draft analysts to others.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. And I love, that not everybody does it the same way, because I think that you gather more information, the more places that you can read and the more people that you can kind of glean from, you gain a larger perspective. So, I definitely do appreciate having that different aspect or philosophy when it comes to analyzing prospects. So, Matt, we have a great list of players that I'm really interested in diving in with you on. Before we get to them, I just want to remind everyone that support for Draft Capital is brought to you by Built Bar. And unlike all the other bars that are out there that taste either like old Play-Doh or a piece of cardboard, when you eat a Built Bar, you will think that you're cheating on your diet with a delicious chocolate dessert. If your kids find out how good these things are, you're going to have to buy more of them because they're going to be begging for them. They have great flavors such as cookies and cream, double chocolate, strawberry, peanut butter brownie, and much, much more. Built Bar also has a mystery flavor that if you guess correctly, you can win a prize. Just go over to Built.com, enter in promo code OFFTHEBALL. That's off the ball with all caps, no spaces, at checkout to get a 10% discount at Built.com. All right, Matt. So I constructed a list of 5 players. I gave you the names ahead of time. These are players that I personally need a little bit more help on because I've done a couple iterations of my big board. These players didn't necessarily fare higher on my big board, just the way that I digest the game. And, I think that when you look at a board, like you start understanding draft philosophies and how that plays out to different individuals. And I like to tell people, and I don't mean this in a bad way, right? But big boards inherently have a bias because it's what you think is more valuable, right, at the next level. And I know bias can kind of be like a trigger word of sorts. I don't mean it disrespectfully, right? But it's like what you think translates well. What do you value in a player? And I came up with a list of 5, and I can't think of a better guest other than you, Matt, to help me kind of untangle the thread of these guys, because obviously I have them lower than y'all. And far be it for me to think that I'm the leading authority when it comes to, evaluating talent. So I'm asking for your help today, Matt, and I know that you're up to it. So the first one that I want to ask you about is Musa Di Abate. He's the 22nd player on the big board that you guys put out over there at Basketball News. He's the 19-year-old freshman playing at Michigan. He's 6'11", 210. I'm just going to do some basic stats here. He's giving you 9 points per game, 6 rebounds, and just a little over half of assists. When I see him, Matt, I'm looking at a player that is pretty raw offensively. If you look at the synergy numbers, he grades out pretty well in a lot of fields, but watching him on the court, it's very raw. And I think what you're buying when you draft a Musa Di Abate is a very versatile defender. And I think that that's the appeal of him, with the hope that he can, kind of mature a little bit offensively over time. Again, he's very young. He's only 19. It's weird also for me too, because watching Michigan at first, everyone kind of was watching for Caleb Houston, right? But now the attention has started to shift a little bit to Diabate. So Matt, just if you could, what is the high end outcome? Like what are you watching when you see Musa?
So I first became familiar with Musa last year at Geico Nationals when he was playing for IMG Academy. And the things that jumped out, I mean, his physical tools are really impressive. He's big, he's long, he's mobile. And I think he's got a frame that's going to fill out nicely. I think he's going to be a stud, grown man in a few years. And, defensively, just sort of, being a high energy big, I think he's going to be very good. With those parts of his game. And I like the fact that I think he can legitimately play the 4 or the 5. And so even though I know the common narrative is, big men are easily replaceable, it's hard to find versatile big men. And so I think he provides a lot of value there when you're building a team, guy that could, play major minutes at either position and defend everybody and, provide a lot of versatility defensively of doing like, aggressive hedges on a high pick and roll, or switching some onto perimeter players. That's where like the main focus of my interest comes from, and I saw that in high school.
Hmm.
Evaluated him in Michigan. I mean, they kind of brought him along slowly. I mean, their team has struggled this year, but they do have a lot of depth, especially up front.
Hmm.
And I thought he did a good job in a limited role, and kind of forced Juwan's hand that he had to increase his role. And I saw him when they played at North Carolina. North Carolina beat them, but Musa was incredible, and he showed me not just in that game, but this season that I do think he's got some upside on the offensive end. I agree that he's somewhat raw and needs some polishing, but you're not starting from scratch. I mean, I think he's got good touch with either hand. He's got natural footwork. It definitely needs to be worked on, but I think you can we work on it, you can develop it, and then he's got a nice shooting touch. I don't think he's ever going to be a knockdown guy, but considering that he potentially could be a very elite guy on the defensive end, and you've got something to work with on the offensive end. Just tells me that I think he's got a chance of being, upside wise, like a solid starter. And so, I mean, if we're talking about, being, mid to late first round pick, I would feel good about that.
Okay, that's totally fair. And I think too, the appeal of him defensively playing the five, I haven't really seen a lot of people speak on that. And I know that you're looking kind of long term, right? Because right now he's 6'11". That's about the size that you want height wise, but 210. We know that when he gets to the NBA that he's going to put on that pro strength, over time. And
And
that's an
I do
aspect.
would say, sorry to cut you off.
Sure.
The
No,
the
please.
210 I think is misleading. I mean, that would tell you that you think the kid is thin and he's not very strong. I mean, watching him, like, he does not get pushed around at all. I mean, he is a strong physical kid. So physically, I'm not worried about him at all in any area.
Okay, fair enough. And I think that that's an area that I haven't considered is the ability to play the five, because when I'm watching him, I see more of a four. But also speaking offensively, I did mention that he's raw, but you look at his shooting splits right now, 30% from three. That's pretty promising, right? And but another indicator, the free throw percentage is not as strong, right? So a little bit of conflicting there. I'm just curious, Matt, like you're, speaking as a player and agent, and a scout as well. What do you look at when projecting a shot? Is I know a lot of people really love pointing out that free throw percentage, but I know that some people talk about touch around the basket, shooting mechanics, things like that. What about the way that he shoots the ball leads you to believe that he can become, that respectable shooter that you were referring to?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just not one thing. It's kind of all of it all together. And I mean, I think obviously shooting mechanics is one. Does he have like a fluid stroke? Is there wasted motion? I mean, and the reason I look for wasted motion is that creates a lot of room for error, right? And
Mhm.
so having a compact, repeatable shot would tell me that there's a chance we could develop this kid into being a consistent shooter, and just having a feel for getting a guy's grip of his touch, which I think is a lot easier to do in person. And that's one part of, like, I really like to get up close and personal at games. And I mean, I feel like a lot of my evaluation on the road is done before the game even starts. I mean, I'm watching the guy's body movements, just trying to get a grip of his personality, shooting mechanics, his touch, how strong his weak hand is, stuff like that. And getting a grip of a guy's shooting potential, I think is really important to see it in person, to see it, how fluid it is, and whatnot.
Oh, that's totally fair. I haven't had a chance to see him in person yet, but the film that I watched, what encourages me about him, the positive things that I see in his game, I love his movement. I think, just removing the shot, just watching him, run on the court and be active and plays very fluid. He moves like a basketball player.
Right. And
And
he's willing and able, which is important.
Mhm.
Just because you've got the capability of doing something, you got to get out there and and do it. My uncle Rob, that worked in the NBA, he passed away now, but worked in the NBA for a long time. He used to always say playing hard is a skill, and it's an undervalued skill that's not discussed enough. And Diabate, I mean, he's got all the physical tools, and he's capable of moving his feet and doing all these things, but he's an effort guy too. And so that combination is really important for me. That it's just, hey, if I'm an NBA coach, I would trust that this kid can get there where I could put him on the floor and we can develop him to where he could be a solid rotation guy at the very least.
And I agree. I do believe that work ethic is a skill as well. And to me, I think that I agree with you, right? Like it is highly undervalued to a lot of people, but when you see people with elite work ethic, it makes it hard for you to want to bet against them, right? So I agree. And watching the incremental growth that he's shown, gaining that trust as a freshman for a team with an experienced coach with pro background, things like that, that does speak volumes to not only, his ability, but that willingness that you're speaking to there, Matt. So totally agree. And just to be upfront with the listeners, that's the only freshman that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be bringing it to a little bit more of the upperclassmen for the rest of the show. And we're going to be shifting to Matthew Mayer out of Baylor. And I know that there are a lot of, players that are capturing the attention and the creativity of the audience right now out of Baylor. Speaking of, Shuhan and Kendall Brown as well. But Matthew Mayer has been at Baylor for quite some time. And you guys over at Basketball News have him ranked 35th on your board. I have him kind of flirting with the second round grade as well right now. And I don't practice ageism, though. It has nothing to do with the fact that he's a senior, Matt. But, he's 22 years old playing for Baylor. He's about 6'9", 225 pounds. Just real basic statistics are about 10 points per game, about 5 rebounds. I'm a little shocked that he's only giving you 1.2 assists per game based on, how involved he is with moving the basketball for Baylor. I'm just curious at what he does at an NBA level next. Like, I guess that's my biggest leading question to you, Matt, is you're drafting him, a high second. There's kind of a bit of variance as to like, is he going to be drafted to a rebuilding team, or is he going to be drafted to like a contending team? There's a little bit of both of those styles at the beginning of the second round draft this season as of today. What do you think Matthew Mayer's best ability is going to be at that next level, Matt?
Well, I mean, there's a few things that come to mind as far as, with his skill set. One key word with him, though, I would say is translatability to the NBA. That's one thing that keeps us high on him. Is he's got great size at 6'9", and he's got an NBA kind of game. I mean, he can create off the dribble. He shoots with range. He can finish at the rim. I mean, I would have hoped that he'd be producing at a higher level. Especially since he's been there for a while. Upperclassmen and everything. And but at the same time, he's playing for a really great team. With a lot of talent and a lot of depth. And so I think there is somewhat of an equal opportunity type of style to their game. Which is probably, holding back his stats and production to a certain extent. But again, I think he's just the size, length, versatility is something that's valuable in the NBA.
And I agree. And we know that Baylor, especially over the last couple seasons, a lot of their emphasis offensively has been coming from, their backcourt players. They've had tremendous scars over the last several seasons. Kenjo transferring over, a huge addition to their team. And obviously, too, you got the stellar play of the freshmen, too. And I think that one thing that you can say for Mayer is the fact that although he is a senior and he's been on this team for quite some time, he doesn't seem to care that other people are shining, and he's still being able to be productive. He's asked to, shoot, put the ball on the ground, play really good, like everything. He's like a garden variety style of player. What are your kind of concerns with him? Like, I know that he's got the frame. I know that he's playing at an established system, and he appears to be a very coachable player. Do you think that there's a certain style of team that should be looking for him, or is he? You spoke to that translatability. Do you feel like he's like a 30-team player?
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of going back to my agent background. I mean, if I were representing him, I see him as a guy that could fit kind of anywhere. I mean, he creates off the dribble. He shoots with range. I mean, he's got size. I mean, he really can be plugged in to just about any system. I don't see see him being one of these guys that would be limited from that standpoint, which also I think adds to a player's value. And one thing that where I'm really critical on is players that lack positional size and/or can't play multiple positions, especially if we're talking about a guy that's probably going to be more of a role type player. Because again, going back to team building. Having guys that play multiple positions and fill up, minute slots just adds their value. I mean, Derek Murray, my colleague, we talk about this a lot. Like he knows the type of players I like and don't like. And if you're an undersized 2 guard that can't play a point at all, that's going to be a guy that I'm going to be lower on than everybody else. And
sure,
again, that's my personal style and like my concept. And it's really, you alluded to this before. It's hard to do rankings where I'm essentially being a scout for every single team in the NBA, right? It's like I'm having to map this out for all 30 teams. Whereas if I were working for one team, my big board in my mock draft would be a lot different because we'd have our priorities set in place. I'm trying to balance it out, but it's still, my personal philosophies do bleed into my rankings naturally.
Yeah, and spoke to that earlier too. What type of players do you like and value? There's nothing wrong with wanting to get a talented, versatile, well coached, likable, player on your team. Everybody needs a player like a Matthew Mayer. It's just, what what area of his skill set do you think translate the most? And that's kind of where I'm struggling a little bit, but I do appreciate, you know, you saying that he's a 30 team starter means more to me than you probably know. So I appreciate you.
One guy that I've talked about, he's not exactly the same, but sort of similar kind of path is
Mhm.
Chandler Parsons. He didn't light the world on fire when he was at Florida. I mean, he was a solid player, a 4-year guy. It was he was a late first, early second round pick. I mean, ended up making a lot of money. I mean, granted, a lot of people ripped that contract that the Grizzlies gave
Yeah.
him. He still got a max contract, so it was a good pick in that draft, and I kind of see Meyer kind of in the same light. Again, not the exact same player, but sort of the same path. A very translatable game with size and versatility. And so, again, I think that's somewhat of a comp.
Yeah, and that's fair. And I'm like, as you were breaking down his game, like, I don't know why, but I was thinking of Nance, obviously not as bouncy as a Nance, but a guy who can give you minutes at that 3 and that 4, can stretch it out a little bit, not a selfish player either. So I actually wrote it down as you were saying it, Chandler Parsons. I got to go back and look at some of those comps there. But Matthew Mayer obviously doing a lot of things well, playing for a really talented team. We'll transition now, Matt, to Johnny Juzang out of UCLA. Now, this team has kind of been a mixed bag for me, just, kind of personally watching them throughout the season. We know that Peyton Watson hasn't been the player that a lot of people came into the season touting him to be. We know that Johnny Juzang maybe kind of influenced, Peyton Watson's commitment to UCLA because, he was flirting with coming out last season, going into the draft. We looked at a kid like Peyton Watson and said, okay, like maybe he's going to be kind of this jumbo creator. Johnny Juzang comes back, and now it's not always a bad thing, right, to have a talented freshman come in and also a returning player like Johnny Juzang, who is a terrific college player. Shout out also to Jaime Jaquez Jr. So you got all these talented players on your team. Johnny Juzang is doing his normal thing, right? Like he's giving you 17 points per game, 5 boards, almost 2 assists. He's 22-year-old junior playing out of UCLA. He's a 6'6", 210 pounds, and he's just a bucket to me, Matt. Like you watch him play, he loves taking difficult shots, and he makes them at a decent clip. And I think that he's grown in his shot selection this season in particular, coming back and playing at UCLA. I don't know if he does really anything else other than being a difficult shot taker at the next level, maybe kind of like a, hopefully turns into a 3-and-D. His defense isn't a net negative, right? But I wouldn't say that you're drafting Johnny Juzang to be a defensive stopper either. What's his, best role at the next level in your opinion, Matt?
Well, let me just sort of break him down all the way around here. So we'll
Sure.
start with the cons on him. Is his foot speed's not very good. Defensively, I don't think he's going to be very good. I mean, the biggest thing is lack of athleticism, foot speed. So, but then the pros is that, okay, the guy is a difficult shot maker, and he's got the sweet stroke, and most importantly for the role I see him in, he's got a healthy level of confidence. He's got some swagger. He's got some, a good amount of, cockiness to him.
Sure.
So the role I see him playing is a guy off the bench that's a specialist. I mean, so now all of a sudden we're talking about a guy at UCLA where his negatives are being magnified because they're depending on him to create a lot of offense, whereas his role as a complementary guy to the NBA, talking about a lot more easier shots. Bringing him off the bench and being a guy that could, shoot off movement, shoot off the catch and shoot, and then create some stuff a little bit secondary because he's not going to be a focal point of defense. I think it translates well. And so a guy that's got the mental toughness and swagger to come off the bench and hit shots at a lower volume is valuable to me. And I think a guy like that, again, I talk about guys that can be plugged in a lot of different spots. A shooter with size, with swagger, everybody needs a guy like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone wants to have like a J.R. Smith type of player on their team, right? So Matt, I want to ask you a question about Johnny. And obviously, I'm not saying that you represent him, but like you have like, let's just imagine that you were representing Johnny Juzang, right? Um, One, how as a representative, right? Like, have you seen that it is easy to go from like a high usage role in college to being kind of like that playmaker, kind of coming off the bench at that next level? What's your experience like dealing with players in that role in particular? And then, how would you go about representing Johnny Juzang like to an organization coming out this year?
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things, for players to do is go from being, a focal point of the offense and being a star to figuring out what their new role is in the NBA. I mean, I look at this a lot when scouting players that aren't, high profile draft prospects. I mean, if we're drafting outside the lottery or looking at players outside the lottery, it, you know, looking at guys' personality types is a big part of this. I mean, obviously we got our upside picks, we got our safe picks, and again, going into the case by case philosophy. We got to project, hey, this guy's personality and skill set will fit in this type of role. I mean, sometimes we like guys that are, in the second round that are not alpha dogs because they might be more willing to accept a role and be a complimentary guy. Whereas, there's certain players, and we all have dealt with guys like this that, need to be the best player in order to be effective. And so I think there's a wide spectrum there. And with Johnny, yeah, I think he'll be fine. I mean, a shooter usually translates pretty well. I mean, that's one skill that, I mean, if you can shoot the ball with range and you've got positional size, you can kind of still have that confident mentality because even if you're playing a limited role, I think it's still valuable. I think the bigger issue is with the alpha dogs that are creating a lot off the dribble that need the ball in their hands. Johnny can be effective even without taking shots. If you have him moving, shaking up the defense, I mean, that's a huge part of having value of shooters on the floor, especially ones that can shoot off the move. Is they shake up the defense, they move the defense without even taking a shot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is a very valuable skill, and that's kind of one area that I've delved into a little bit throughout this season so far, Matt, is what I'm affectionately referring to now as traditional, shot creation, that on the ball dominance that you see, like someone will take someone off the dribble and get a bucket. But with a guy like, say, for example, a Kendall Brown, it what I'm calling, kind of like non-traditional shot creation, you can move so well off the ball that it is almost a guaranteed bucket. So it'll be interesting to see Johnny Juzang kind of transition from not so much on the ball, but how well he can move without it. But we've seen, Jaime Jaquez Jr. is a good shot, kind of similar, as a matter of fact, to Matthew Mayer earlier. Like, they're good at setting their teammates up, and Johnny Juzang has been a benefactor of that during his time in UCLA. So, Matt, we'll transition now to our next prospect, and we might spend a little bit of time here because I'm really curious to see. Not everyone has Drew Timme as a draftable prospect, right? And I'm sure you're well aware of that. Playing next to Chet Holmgren, playing for the team that he does, he's surrounded by talent. Like, there are freshmen who, if they go to almost any other team right now, are getting a ton of minutes and looking, a lot more draftable. But Drew Timme has kind of been a mainstay for this team for the past couple seasons. 21-year-old junior playing out of Gonzaga. He's 6'10", 235. He's averaging close to 19 points per game, 6 rebounds, and pretty good passer, almost 2.5 assists per game. I'm curious to see, Matt, like, what the case is for drafting a Drew Timme, because I think that if I was trying to sell Drew Timme to an organization, right, it would be, you're drafting a winner. You're drafting someone who can create for himself and others out of the post. It looks like he's trying to attempt to stretch his game out to deep, and I wouldn't bet against a player with his work ethic that he could eventually get that range out there. My concern is the foot speed on the defensive end, the rim protection. I think obviously, like, that's why Gonzaga is as successful as they are right now. But we have seen, even out of Gonzaga, players who have been, touted with not having elite foot speed or not being elite rim protectors go on and be successful in the NBA. Shout out to Domantas Sabonis, right? What about Drew Timme to you says that he is draftable? And I guess, like, what is his ideal role at the next level?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been high on Timme. I mean, I've gradually moved back off of him. I mean, I see the concerns. I mean, the lack of foot speed is clear cut. I mean, and this is a guy, if this were 20 years ago, I mean, this guy might be a mid first round pick.
Oh, for sure.
Not a lottery pick, right? I mean, he reminds me of Kevin Mchale. The problem is Kevin Mchale was successful in the 80s, So,
yeah.
I mean, could have been used as a 4-5, and now he's probably going to be limited to be strictly a 5, just because of the lack of speed and quickness. And his body, he hasn't got his body together at all, which really bugs me. I was hoping that this summer he would have really committed to the weight room and kind of taken a jump there, and he definitely hasn't. That doesn't mean he still can address it moving forward, get into an NBA weight program. But that's something I think that could potentially help him. As far as his game goes, I mean, he's certainly at the college level, a dominant low post scorer. He's just got such a great feel, footwork. He's got great touch and shot making ability with both hands over both shoulders. And one thing that I think people lose sight of with guys like him when they translate to the NBA is, okay, granted, teams aren't running, the style offense they used to, where they're throwing it out on the post and let the double team come. I mean, it's not traditional basketball like that by any means anymore. Mm-hmm. However, low post scorers are still be able to use interior low post scoring moves. It just comes within the flow of the game more than before. And so I still value Timme's low post scoring abilities.
Sure.
And he's a guy, if you watch him even now at Gonzaga, there's a lot of moments where he's getting the ball in not traditional post up spots, and he turns himself into it, puts him in a spot where he's essentially becoming a low post scorer out of nowhere. And so I do think he'll be able to do some of that in the NBA. And then I trust his ability, just with how good his touch is and how skilled he is. I do think when he's forced to adapt, I do think he's going to be able to stretch it and shoot the ball. And so I think I'm naturally more confident in him at the NBA than a lot of people are. But I do understand the argument. I'm just kind of looking at it through a different lens of like projecting how his game can change and how it can fit in. But if anybody's wanting to rip on like, hey, we don't want to take him because he's going to get exposed in the high pick and roll like he did against Baylor in the championship game, I can't really argue that.
Yeah, and just to be fair to you, right? Like, you're giving your case for Timme. You guys over at Basketball News have him ranked 48, so it's not like you guys have him as a mid to late.
And I've had him a lot higher in the past, and I've my guys have been on me. They're a little younger than me. I think they're a little less traditional as a result of that. Not that I'm right and they're wrong, but and that's one reason I like having different personalities around me. We have some guys that have some analytics backgrounds and stuff like that. It helps balance me out, which is exactly how an NBA front office should be built. Is the decision maker should have people around him to challenge him, to keep balanced, and so that's what my guys have done, and they've got me to cool off on Timme, but I do still like him.
Yeah, and that's fair. And it's good to speak on that, stepping out of an echo chamber, because, getting that different perspective, not even just in basketball, right? Like, that's good for life, but especially in basketball, hearing those different perspectives and, being willing to adjust to them and then being willing to adjust to you too. So we'll shift now to the last player that the guys that I talk draft with, they ask me all the time, is this guy your cousin and everything like that, because my last name's Gillespie, his last name's Gillespie. They spell it differently. He spells it Gillespie. Mine's with an A, Vice and E. But, the 22-year-old senior playing out of Villanova, he's about 6'3", 190 pounds. He's giving you 17 points per game, 3 rebounds, 3 assists. Matt, I'm curious, is this like a Ryan Arcidiacono type player that you're seeing at that next level? And again, speaking to where you guys have him on the board, he's 56, so he's not the tail end of the second round. So it's not a mid to late first round player that we're talking about here. But a lot of people, kind of like Drew Timme, some people don't have Collin Gillespie listed as a draftable player. I myself am in that camp. But again, tail end of the second round pick, senior, great senior college point guard, by the way. He's not just like a serviceable one. He's terrific. He's outstanding. He is the leader on this team. And I think based on what we've seen from Villanova of the past couple seasons, this is probably the least talented team that he's working with. Like, there's still, Jermaine Samuels Jr. is on this team as well. And there was talks about him preseason coming in with maybe some draft expectation as well. Collin is still plugging away, and he's still doing all the things well that he has over the past couple seasons. What is the case for him being a draftable player, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, he's a safe pick, right? I mean, I don't see him as like this sexy prospect that's got crazy upside. But he's a senior that's playing for arguably the best coach in the country. I mean, guys, go and get in this role and end up being like the veteran leader of a Jay Wright Villanova team. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, he really preps these guys to step in and be good pros. Very well rounded. I mean, he's a tough kid, leader. overachiever type. I mean, I trust him. Say it's in a limited role in the NBA. I'm gonna trust him with the ball. I'm gonna trust him to hit open shots. He's gonna play good basketball. He's gonna be a good team guy. And so I don't think he's a lock to get drafted.
Sure.
But I'm similar to like a TJ McConnell that came in and kind of scrapped his way into becoming a solid NBA player. I could see a similar type of trajectory for this kid. It doesn't blow you away with the tools or anything like that, but he's just you trust him, and he's sort of a coach's favorite type because he's gonna do all the little things.
Yeah, I mean, a player like Collin goes out on the court, and a coach should be comfortable that whatever the game plan is, that he's going to see to it that it's executed on both ends of the floor, right? Like we talk about how good he is on the offensive end. I don't think that this season is necessarily highlighting as much as we've seen in previous seasons, but he is also a very capable defender to where, in a team construct, not
Right.
saying that guard defense is of the most, paramount importance at the NBA level, but you still have to be able to be serviceable. You can't get
Sure.
played off the court. I don't think that Collin is going to be one of those players that just outright gets played off the court.
Yeah,
And
he's so tough, competitive, and he's well coached. I mean, and again, going back to what we talked about before is, you can have all the ability in the world, but if you don't have that mental toughness and make the
Mhm.
choice of playing hard, it's worth nothing. Colin's got his limitations, but like he chooses to play basketball the right way every single possession, and there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I like I said, I have him outside my second, but I certainly respect and like I get the logic of wanting a Collin Gillespie on your team because he's a winner. He's going to make sure that the plays and that the defensive schemes are set up the correct way. A coach isn't going to have to worry about whether or not the team is going to execute when you have a Collin Gillespie out there on the court. So Matt, that was all the players that I had scheduled to discuss with you today. First off, I just want to thank you so much for your time. It's an honor to have you here on Draft Capital, and for people here listening on the Nothing But Net channel on Dash Radio, again, a huge honor to have you on the show, Matt. Before we let you go and we close off and letting the people know where they can find you and all that stuff, I want to ask you because you're a prominent pillar in the draft community. I want to ask you, like, what sort of advice could you offer, aspiring talent evaluators or maybe kind of more independents like myself? Like, what advice could you give them?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just it's a hard industry to get into, and so I mean, if you're passionate about it, just stay with it. I mean, it's for anybody to find success in sports. I mean, I think is an admirable thing because it's just like what you have to do early on to get over the hump. At times feels overwhelming and impossible, and so you got to stay with it, chip away at it. From strictly a scouting standpoint. And there's so many independent scouts that are aspiring professional scouts that are doing this on their own. Doing what you can to get out there to see players in person. I can't stress it enough. And I understand that it's a hard thing to do because it takes time and it takes money to get out there. But you talk to anybody that's scouting at a high level, most of them would tell you how important it is to be out there. And I always tell my guys, you got to be out there in the trenches, and for a number of different reasons of seeing with your own eyes, like we talked about before, of like evaluating a guy's body type and movements and personality and his shooting mechanics, but also that's how you network. And sports, it's sort of like a good old boy kind of community, and it's all about who you know, and so that's how you gather intel, that's how you compare notes with each other, that's how you get jobs. And so do what you can to get out there and get experience and meet people and see basketball.
Absolutely. And I can kind of speak to that last point as well. I recently took a trip to South Carolina. I'm down here in Georgia right now, but I drove up to South Carolina and was able to watch, Jabari Smith Jr. play against University of South Carolina, and just watching a player, pregame workout and see what they're working on, see how intense they are or not they are. Coming in, seeing a guy like Jabari Smith Jr., Walker Kessler, and I appreciated how animated like the assistant coaches are during workouts and things like that. I don't think that enough people understand like how involved the coaching staff truly is in helping these players, continue to grow and develop and things like that. It's one thing to have a great skill set, but having someone that's willing to invest the time, effort, and energy into you to help you become a better player, I think that speaks volumes to, the ultimate rise of success that we see with these players. But Matt, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot from these players that I had questions on, so I appreciate you breaking them down for me. Before we let you go, I just would, if you could please, sir, just let the folks know where they can find you and your work.
Yeah, sure. So I provide all the draft and scouting coverage for basketballnews.com. So you'll find the bulk of my work there. And then on the social media platforms on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, my handle is Matt Babcock 11. So if you give me a follow and give basketballnews.com a follow, we'll do our best to provide some good content.
And I highly recommend it. All of my, viewers and listeners right now, please go and do yourselves a favor. Go and follow Matt Babcock and the other fine folks at Basketball News. I also had, Mark Schindler early on in the season, another one of your colleagues at Basketball News. He was kind enough to come on the show, so getting to know him a little bit more was a lot of fun too. But for my special guest today, Matt Babcock, for myself, for the fine folks at Built Bar and the Nothing But Net channel on Dash Radio, this has been Draft Capital, and we will catch up with you all next